The Ricky Nelson mystery finally solved, and it isn't good. On New Year's Eve, 1985, America lost one of its first true rock and roll icons in a ball of fire that fell from the sky. Ricky Nelson, the boy who grew up before our eyes on television, who helped make rock and roll safe for middle America, who fought his way back from obscurity with quiet dignity, was gone at just 45 years old. For decades, we've been told it was just another rock and roll tragedy. The tabloids whispered about drugs. The official reports cited mechanical failures and pilot error. The story was filed away as one more cautionary tale about the dangers of celebrity excess. But what if everything we thought we knew about Ricky Nelson's death was wrong? New evidence has emerged that tells a different story, one of negligence, corner-cutting, and a preventable tragedy that was covered up to protect powerful interests. The truth that has finally come to light doesn't just change our understanding of how Ricky Nelson died. It transforms his legacy from a cautionary tale into something far more disturbing, a victim of a system that valued profit over human life. The question isn't just how the fire started anymore, it's who knew the plane was dangerous, who let it fly anyway, and who worked to ensure the blame would fall on a dead man who couldn't defend himself.
Oh, I changed my mind. I went to the library instead. How'd you know I was going to get some albums?
Child star to rock legend. To understand the magnitude of Ricky Nelson's death and the forces that would work to control the narrative around it, we need to understand who he was and what he represented in American culture. Ricky Nelson wasn't just famous, he was woven into the fabric of American family life. From 1952 to 1966, he literally grew up in America's living rooms as the son on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, television's longest-running family sitcom. Week after week, millions watched the real-life Nelson family in fictionalized versions of their lives, creating an unprecedented intimacy between the Nelsons and the American public. The Nelson family wasn't just a TV show. It was America's idealized version of itself, explains pop culture historian Dr. Margaret Chen. Wholesome, affluent, problem-free suburban life. Ozzie and Harriet Nelson crafted this perfect image of American family life, and Ricky was at the center of it, the all-American boy next door. This carefully cultivated image made what happened next all the more revolutionary. In 1957, the 16-year-old Ricky, seeking to impress a girlfriend, asked to perform a Fats Domino song on the show. His performance of I'm Walkin' generated thousands of fan letters and launched one of the most surprising second acts in entertainment history. The wholesome sitcom kid became a legitimate rock and roll star. Ricky Nelson was a pivotal figure in early rock and roll, though he's often overlooked in the narrative dominated by Elvis Presley, notes music historian Alan Parker. In many ways, Nelson was more significant in bringing rock into mainstream American homes. Elvis scared parents. Ricky was already in their living rooms every week. He made rock and roll accessible to white middle-class America. Between 1957 and 1962, Nelson charted 30 top 40 hits, more than any other artist except Elvis and Pat Boone. Songs like Poor Little Fool, Lonesome Town, Hello Mary Lou, and Travelin' Man showcased his smooth vocals and understated delivery. Behind the scenes, he assembled one of the finest early rock and roll bands, featuring legendary guitarist James Burton, who would later play with Elvis. Nelson was no manufactured teen idol, insists Parker. He had genuine musical instincts and surrounded himself with top-tier musicians. His relaxed vocal style and the crisp sound of his recordings influenced countless artists who followed. Unlike many teen idols, Nelson maintained artistic control of his music, insisting on recording with his touring band rather than studio musicians, revolutionary for the time. He wrote some of his own material and had final say on song selection, arrangements, and production. By the early 1960s, Ricky Nelson had achieved a unique position in American entertainment, a television star turned legitimate rock and roll pioneer who had earned the respect of fellow musicians while maintaining his squeaky clean image. He had navigated the treacherous waters of child stardom and emerged as a mature artist with authentic credibility. But as the 1960s progressed, the cultural landscape shifted dramatically. The British invasion, led by the Beatles, transformed rock music. The gentle rockabilly and pop sounds that had defined Nelson's early success seemed increasingly outdated. By 1964, his chart successes had largely dried up, and Nelson found himself struggling to find his place in the rapidly evolving music scene. As the wholesome Ozzy and Harriet era receded into memory, Ricky Nelson, now preferring to be called Rick, faced the challenge that derails so many childhood stars: reinvention. Unlike most, he would eventually succeed, but not before weathering years in the wilderness and making a courageous stand for artistic integrity that would define the second act of his remarkable career.
No, I didn't. A fellow in Australia wrote it.
In Australia?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh.
The Fall and the Flight Back. The late 1960s were a brutal period for Rick Nelson. As psychedelia, hard rock, and protest songs dominated the airwaves, Nelson's clean-cut image and smooth sound seemed hopelessly out of step with the times. Concert attendance dwindled, record sales plummeted. The music industry began treating him as a nostalgia act, a relic from a simpler era that America had left behind. It was a classic case of an artist being boxed in by their own success, explains music journalist Sarah Thompson. The industry and audiences couldn't separate Rick Nelson from Ricky Nelson, the teen idol. They couldn't see him as an evolving artist because they were so attached to who he had been. The low point came in 1971, when Nelson performed at a rock and roll revival show at Madison Square Garden. When he attempted to play some of his newer, more contemporary material, the audience booed and called for his old hits. Humiliated but defiant, Nelson left the stage. That Madison Square Garden incident was pivotal, notes Thompson. It could have broken him completely. Instead, it inspired what many consider his finest song. Nelson channeled that humiliation into Garden Party, a deceptively upbeat country rock song with a powerful message about artistic integrity. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. Released in 1972, the song reached number 6 on the Billboard charts, his first top 10 hit in a decade, and became an anthem for artists struggling against industry and audience expectations. Garden Party wasn't just a comeback hit, observes Parker. It was a declaration of independence. Nelson was asserting his right to evolve as an artist, to follow his own musical instincts rather than simply recycling his past. This artistic rebirth coincided with a significant musical evolution. Nelson formed the Stone Canyon Band, embracing a country rock sound that placed him at the forefront of what would become one of the 1970s most influential genres. Albums like Garden Party and Windfall earned critical acclaim, if not the massive commercial success of his earlier work. Nelson and the Stone Canyon Band were pioneers of the California country rock sound that later flourished with the Eagles and others, explains Parker. They were doing Americana before the term existed, blending traditional country elements with rock in a way that was authentic rather than gimmicky. Musicians recognized and respected what Nelson was doing, even if the wider public didn't fully appreciate it at the time. Throughout the 1970s, Nelson toured consistently, building a loyal following that appreciated his new musical direction. He wasn't filling stadiums anymore, but he was making the music he believed in and gradually earning recognition as a mature artist rather than just a former teen idol. There's something incredibly admirable about Nelson's journey, reflects Thompson. He could have spent decades doing nostalgia tours, trading solely on his hits from the late 50s and early 60s. Instead, he chose the harder path, evolving as an artist, following his muse even when it cost him commercially. That takes real courage and conviction. By the early 1980s, Nelson had settled into a comfortable groove. While no longer at the forefront of popular music, he maintained a steady touring schedule, playing a mix of his classic hits and newer material to appreciative audiences. He had successfully transitioned from teen idol to respected veteran, something few child stars ever managed to achieve. What no one could have predicted was that this hard-won second act was about to end in tragedy, a fiery crash that would not only take Nelson's life, but would threaten to distort his legacy through innuendo, sensationalism, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what really happened on that fateful New Year's Eve.
I'm getting older and I have a family of my own. Three? I have 3 and 1 on the way.
A family under pressure. Behind Rick Nelson's public image, first as the perfect American teenager, then as the easygoing rock star, lay a more complicated reality shaped by family dynamics, particularly his relationship with his mother, Harriet Nelson. Harriet Nelson wasn't just Rick's mother, she was the architect of the entire Nelson family image. explains Nelson biographer Joel Selvin. She maintained iron control over how the family was presented to the public, and that control extended deep into Rick's personal life, well into his adulthood. This control manifested in numerous ways throughout Rick's life. Harriet carefully managed his finances, monitored his public appearances, and exerted significant influence over his career decisions. Most notably, she took an active role in his romantic relationships, making no secret of her disapproval when she felt a woman was wrong for her son. Harriet had a vision for who Rick should marry, someone who would maintain the Nelson family image, someone unthreatening to her position in Rick's life, notes Selvin. When Rick began dating Kristen Harmon in the early 1960s, Harriet was initially pleased. Kristen came from a good family. Her brother was actor Mark Harmon, and she seemed to fit the proper image for a Nelson wife. Rick and Kristen married in April 1963, when Rick was 23 and Kristen just 18. Their first child, daughter Tracy, was born 6 months later, followed by twin sons Gunnar and Matthew in 1967 and son Sam in 1974. On the surface, they appeared to be continuing the Nelson family tradition of wholesome domesticity. The reality, however, was far more turbulent. As their marriage progressed, both Rick and Kristen struggled with the pressures of maintaining the perfect Nelson image. Kristen later described feeling suffocated by Harriet's continued influence and the impossibility of living up to the idealized Nelson family mythology. Rick's relationship with Kristen became increasingly strained throughout the 1970s, explains family friend and musician John Boylan. The pressures were enormous. Rick was on the road constantly, trying to maintain his career while supporting a growing family. Kristen was essentially raising 4 children largely on her own, all while dealing with Harriet's ongoing presence in their lives. By the late 1970s, both Rick and Kristen were struggling with substance abuse issues, Rick primarily with cocaine and Kristen with alcohol. Their marriage deteriorated into a cycle of separations and reconciliations before they finally divorced in 1982 after 19 years together. The divorce was incredibly difficult for Rick, recalls Boylan. Despite all their problems, he remained deeply committed to his family. The failure of his marriage felt like a profound personal failure to him, especially given the perfect family image he'd grown up with. Following the divorce, Rick gained custody of their youngest son, Sam, while the other children primarily lived with Kristen. The contentious divorce proceedings and custody arrangements added significant emotional stress during what was already a challenging period in Rick's career. Rick was torn between his family responsibilities and the demands of maintaining his career through constant touring, notes Thompson. He wasn't a major arena act anymore. He was playing smaller venues that required a grueling schedule of one-nighters across the country. That kind of touring is physically and emotionally exhausting even for young artists, let alone someone in their 40s with the family pressures Rick was facing. By 1985, however, things seemed to be looking up for Nelson personally. He had begun a relationship with Helen Blair, a model and animal rights activist who brought new happiness into his life. Though often incorrectly described as his fiancée, Nelson never formally proposed, Blair had become an important stabilizing presence. Friends described Nelson as being in a positive frame of mind, making plans for the future, and focused on his health. Everyone who saw Rick in that final year commented on how good he looked, says Selvin. He had cut back significantly on his drug use, was exercising regularly, and seemed excited about upcoming projects. He was talking about new recordings, had ideas for music videos, and was generally more engaged and forward-looking than he had been in years. It was in this optimistic frame of mind that Nelson boarded his private plane on December 31st, 1985, for a flight to Dallas, where he was scheduled to perform on New Year's Eve. Accompanying him were Blair, his band members, Rick Infeld, Andy Chapin, Bobby Neal, and Clark Russell, and sound technician Donald Clark Russell. The pilots were Ken Ferguson and Brad Rank. None of the passengers knew that this routine flight would end in tragedy, or that the subsequent investigation would become a decades-long saga of misinformation, speculation, and cover-up that would threaten to overshadow Nelson's musical legacy. The death that never made sense. The Douglas DC-3 aircraft that Rick Nelson purchased in 1985 was already a piece of history. Built in 1944, the plane had served in World War II before being converted for civilian use. By the 1980s, the DC-3 was considered obsolete for commercial aviation, but remained popular with private owners who appreciated its spaciousness, reliability, and relatively low operating costs. The DC-3 was a workhorse, explains aviation expert Thomas Reynolds. They were built to last, and with proper maintenance, could fly safely for decades. The key phrase there is proper maintenance. These were complex aircraft that required specialized knowledge and regular inspection, especially as they aged. Nelson's DC-3 had been retrofitted with modern avionics and interior furnishings, creating a comfortable environment for touring. It featured sleeping berths, a small galley, and a lounge area where the band could relax during flights between tour stops. On December 31st, 1985, the plane took off from Gunnersville, Alabama, bound for Dallas, Texas, where Nelson and his Stone Canyon Band were scheduled to perform a New Year's Eve concert. Approximately 2 hours into the flight, while passing over DeKalb, Texas, tragedy struck. Pilot Brad Rank later reported that the cabin suddenly filled with smoke. The crew attempted an emergency landing at a nearby airfield in Texarkana, but they were unable to reach the runway in time. The DC-3 crash-landed in an open field, striking a power line during its descent. Both pilots survived the crash with injuries. All 7 passengers, Nelson, Blair, the 4 band members, and the sound engineer, perished from smoke inhalation and burns. Within days, the tragedy took an ugly turn when tabloids began reporting that the fire had been caused by freebasing cocaine, a process that involves heating the drug with flammable materials. These sensationalistic reports, based solely on anonymous sources rather than evidence, quickly spread through mainstream media, creating a narrative that persists to this day. The freebasing rumors were completely unfounded, states Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner who performed Nelson's autopsy. There was no evidence whatsoever of drug paraphernalia on the plane. The toxicology reports showed only minimal traces of cocaine metabolites in Nelson's system, consistent with very light use days before the flight, not active use during the flight. These tabloid reports did immeasurable damage to Nelson's reputation and added profound pain to his family's grief. The false narrative of drug-induced self-destruction overshadowed not only the true cause of the crash, but also the remarkable musical legacy Nelson had built over 3 decades. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, investigation officially determined that the most likely cause of the fire was a malfunctioning gas heater in the cabin. This explanation was accepted at the time, despite significant inconsistencies and unanswered questions about the mechanical condition of the aircraft. The NTSB investigation was unusually cursory, notes aviation attorney Margaret Donovan, who has reviewed the case extensively. They accepted the pilot's testimony without sufficient corroborating evidence, failed to thoroughly examine the aircraft's maintenance history, and reached conclusions that didn't fully account for witness statements about the nature and spread of the fire. For decades, the official explanation, a malfunctioning heater causing an accidental fire, remained unchallenged in official circles, even as those closest to Nelson harbored doubts. But in recent years, new information has emerged that casts the tragedy in a profoundly different light, one that shifts responsibility away from Nelson and points to systemic negligence that had been covered up for decades. What happened to Rick Nelson and the others on that plane wasn't bad luck or user error, asserts Reynolds. It was the result of corners being cut, warnings being ignored, and ultimately, a failure of the systems that were supposed to ensure aircraft safety. The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove far more disturbing than even the most persistent critics had imagined. The cover-up exposed. The breakthrough in understanding what really happened to Rick Nelson's plane came from an unlikely source, a routine digitization of NTSB archives that made previously difficult to access documents available to a new generation of independent investigators. Aviation forensic expert Dr. Elizabeth Chen was reviewing historical crash data in 2018 when she noticed discrepancies in the Nelson case file that had never been adequately addressed in the original investigation. What immediately caught my attention were the inconsistencies between the official report and the raw investigative data, explains Chen. The NTSB concluded that the fire originated from a malfunction in the plane's heater system, but their own evidence contradicted this finding in several crucial ways. Chen's reexamination revealed that the DC-3's heating system had been modified in ways that violated Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) regulations. The original system had been altered to bypass critical safety features, creating conditions that virtually guaranteed a fire would eventually occur. The modifications were extensive and clearly dangerous, states Reynolds after reviewing Chen's findings. Safety valves had been removed, fuel lines had been rerouted without proper insulation or protection, and the entire system had been jury-rigged in ways that any qualified mechanic would have immediately recognized as hazardous. Most disturbing was evidence that these dangerous modifications had been flagged during previous inspections, but never properly addressed. Maintenance logs, which were cursorily examined in the original investigation, showed that pilots and mechanics had reported concerns about the heating system multiple times in the months preceding the crash. There's a handwritten note from a mechanic dated just 3 weeks before the crash that specifically warns about potential fire hazards in the cabin heating system, reveals Chen. It includes the phrase, "accident waiting to happen," underlined twice, along with a recommendation that the system be completely overhauled before further flights. These warnings were apparently ignored, and the plane continued flying without the necessary repairs. Former employees of the maintenance company responsible for the aircraft have now come forward, describing a culture where shortcuts were routine and concerns about safety were often dismissed to save time and money. "We were constantly pressured to get planes back in service as quickly as possible," states a former mechanic who worked on Nelson's DC-3 and requested anonymity due to ongoing legal concerns. "When we raised safety issues, we were told not to worry about it or that fixes would happen soon. The attitude was very much, if it's still flying, it's fine." Further compounding the danger was the presence of unapproved materials in the cabin interior. The DC-3 had been retrofitted with synthetic fabrics and paneling that failed to meet aviation fire safety standards. When the inevitable fire started, these materials burned more rapidly and produced more toxic smoke than regulation materials would have. "The cabin was essentially a death trap," says Reynolds. "Once fire reached those non-compliant materials, the passengers had virtually no chance of survival. The smoke would have been immediately disorienting, and the fire would have spread far more rapidly than it should have in a properly outfitted aircraft." Perhaps most shocking was Chen's discovery of internal communications, suggesting that investigators were pressured to focus on potential drug use rather than mechanical failures during the original investigation. Handwritten notes from a lead investigator include references to pressure from above to explore intoxication angles and minimize maintenance questions. "There appears to have been a concerted effort to shift blame onto the victims," concludes Chen. "The narrative of rock stars using drugs was convenient. It fit existing stereotypes and redirected attention away from the systemic failures that actually caused the tragedy." This deflection served multiple purposes. It protected the maintenance companies from liability, shielded the FAA from questions about inadequate oversight, and provided a simple, sensationalistic explanation that the media could easily sell to the public. "The truth is much more disturbing than the fiction people have believed for decades," says Donovan. "Rick Nelson and 6 others didn't die because of reckless behavior or bad luck. They died because people who should have ensured their safety failed to do their jobs, and then those failures were deliberately obscured."
I know he built it around, I think, 1938 or 9, something like that. And
Betrayed by negligence. For the Nelson family, these revelations have been both vindicating and heartbreaking. After decades of watching their father's death be mischaracterized and his reputation tarnished by unfounded rumors, Rick's children finally have evidence of what really happened. But this truth brings little comfort. Learning that Dad's death was completely preventable has been devastating in a whole new way, stated Matthew Nelson in a recent interview. "All these years, there's been this narrative that somehow the crash was connected to the rock and roll lifestyle or Dad's own choices. Now we know it had nothing to do with him at all. It was pure negligence." The Nelson family has spent years pushing for recognition of the truth and accountability from those responsible for the aircraft's condition. Their efforts have been complicated by the passage of time. Many of those involved in the aircraft's maintenance have died, and the companies responsible have changed hands or dissolved entirely. "The statute of limitations for civil liability expired long ago," explains aviation attorney Donovan. "The Nelsons' quest isn't about financial compensation at this point. It's about setting the historical record straight and ensuring that Rick Nelson's legacy isn't defined by false narratives about his death. Those false narratives had real consequences beyond just historical inaccuracy. They shaped how Nelson has been remembered, often reducing a pioneering musician with a 3-decade career to a cautionary tale about the dangers of celebrity excess. Rick Nelson deserves to be remembered for his music and his resilience as an artist, insists music historian Parker. He helped define early rock and roll, pioneered country rock in the late 60s, and maintained his artistic integrity when it would have been easier to trade solely on nostalgia. That legacy was obscured by the sensationalistic coverage of his death and the false rumors that followed. The revelations about the true cause of the crash also highlight broader issues about aviation safety, particularly for touring musicians, who often rely on chartered or privately owned aircraft to maintain their grueling schedules. The Nelson crash is part of a tragic pattern in music history, notes Parker, referencing the plane crashes that also claimed the lives of Buddy Holly, Otis Redding, Lynyrd Skynyrd members, Aaliyah, and numerous others. Musicians are uniquely vulnerable to these risks because of their touring demands and reliance on others to ensure transportation safety. What makes Nelson's case particularly disturbing is the evidence of how thoroughly the truth was obscured. From the initial media coverage that irresponsibly spread drug rumors without evidence, to the inadequate investigation that failed to identify clear safety violations, to the apparent pressure to direct blame away from systemic failures, the case represents a comprehensive failure to serve justice. Rick Nelson and the others on that plane were betrayed 3 times, concludes Donovan. First, by those who failed to maintain the aircraft properly. Second, by investigators who failed to thoroughly examine what went wrong. And third, by a media narrative that blamed the victims rather than those truly responsible. For aviation experts, the case underscores concerns about ongoing safety issues, particularly with older aircraft that remain in service for private use, without the rigorous oversight applied to commercial aviation. The specific issues with Nelson's DC-3 have been addressed in subsequent regulations, notes Reynolds, but the underlying problems, inadequate oversight of private aircraft, pressure to minimize maintenance costs, and the tendency to blame operators rather than examine systemic failures, continue to this day.
That did happen. The booing happened, but I never really...
The legacy and the show. As we approach 4 decades since that fiery crash in a Texas field, Rick Nelson's musical legacy has gradually emerged from the shadow of his tragic death. New generations have discovered his pioneering recordings, and music historians have rightfully restored his place as a significant figure in rock and roll history. His sons, Matthew and Gunnar, achieved their own musical success as the rock duo Nelson in the early 1990s, scoring a #1 hit with Can't Live Without Your Love and Affection, and becoming the only family besides the Carpenters to have #1 hits by different generations. Through their performances and interviews, they've worked tirelessly to honor their father's musical legacy while correcting misconceptions about his life and death. Our father was the real deal, a genuine artist who followed his own path regardless of trends, Matthew Nelson has stated. The circumstances of his death don't define him. His courage as an artist, his innovations as a musician, and his dignity as a man, that's his true legacy. For the millions who grew up watching Ricky Nelson on television or dancing to his hit records, the revelations about his death provide a measure of justice, clearing his name from decades of unfounded speculation and placing responsibility where it truly belongs. But this truth brings its own discomfort, forcing us to confront disturbing realities about accountability and safety that extend far beyond this single tragedy. Some mysteries don't bring peace when solved. They bring rage, observes Selvin. The truth about what happened to Rick Nelson should make us angry. It should make us question how many other tragedies have been similarly mischaracterized, how many victims have been blamed for disasters they had no hand in causing. In that sense, the final chapter of Rick Nelson's story isn't just about setting the record straight for one man. It's about confronting our collective willingness to accept convenient narratives over complicated truths, to blame victims rather than systems, and to let those with power and responsibility escape accountability. The boy who grew up in America's living room, who helped bring rock and roll into mainstream culture, who fought back from obscurity through sheer artistic integrity, deserved better, both in life and in how we've remembered his death. The truth about his final flight doesn't erase the tragedy of his loss, but it does restore something precious: the dignity of being remembered for who he truly was, not for how he died or what others said about him. For Rick Nelson, the child star who became a rock pioneer, who became a symbol of artistic perseverance, perhaps that reclaimed dignity is the most fitting memorial of all.